Okay, so we are reacting to why all of your clothes are worse now. So let's jump straight into it.
Shopping at Abercrombie for the first time since I was in high school, mildly triggering because this was like the coolest store back in the day, but I could never afford it because my family is middle class. Now that I'm here, I'm noticing two main things. One is that everything is kind of affordable, which was definitely not the case in high school. The other thing that I'm noticing is that everything is just a little bit shittier than you would want it to be. I'm seeing a lot of like loose threads on things and a lot of stuff that's just made out of 100% synthetic fabric. The clothing just doesn't feel like this nice, firm, high quality that I associated with.
Sometimes I always wonder, like, what kind of quality control is a brand under where there are literally loose threads all over the store? Do you know how many hands have to touch a garment before it gets in a store like that? And then the people that, put it on the racks, obviously it's not their responsibility to do quality control, but like a manager, there should be some sort of process where a manager like flags these things. It's crazy that things can get all the way to the shop floor and not one person, or there's no process in which it's like the construction of this is really bad. Like, why are there loose threads all over the place? That's crazy.
Abercrombie still does sell some high quality clothing.
Actually, I really like this dress and would totally buy it.
And I'm glad they've decided to start using normal lighting in their stores. But seeing so much cheap and low quality stuff there made me wonder, did clothing used to be better when I was a teenager? Not just at Abercrombie, but across the board.
Short answer, yes, clothing was better.
So I scoured eBay, Depop, and Poshmark for clothes from trusted brands of the 90s and 2000s. Then I went to those same stores and bought the 2024 version of each item.
Abercrombie was like legendary for really high quality denim.
To compare the old and new, I got help from Amanda McCarty.
I worked as a buyer in the fashion industry for about 20 years. In the span of my career, I saw how what we sell people changed. The two major changes, I would say, are one, nothing fits properly anymore. It's not you, it's nothing about your body, you're great. And two, the longevity of these clothes, even how you feel when you put them on, has degraded so much. It's just not a good deal.
It's not just in my head, it has gotten harder to find quality clothes that last, even at brands you used to like. If you're wondering.
Yeah, that's facts. Like most brands, the quality has gone down. I remember when I was younger, the Gap was actually decent quality for what it was. A lot of like brands that we consider like not luxury were quite decent quality wise. Ethics is another conversation, but quality wise, they weren't super bad. Leo says quality control is probably very hard to navigate on 10,000s of garments, but still bad, not gonna lie. Yeah, I think we've spoken about this before, but quality control is obviously a very difficult thing to do when you have so many moving parts, especially when your company is huge and you have factories all over the world and different things. But I think as a company, if you care enough, you will have checks and balances in place to make sure these things don't happen. It just comes down to like, do you care or do you not? And my guess would be that most companies don't care, because what they care about really is the financial statement. That's what's the most important. Anything else is secondary. So they don't really see the need to spend resources checking all these things all the time and like probably losing money because they have to throw things out. But I think, in my opinion, that mentality is very short-sighted, because a lot of these brands, the more they are known for, especially it's worse for luxury brands, because with luxury brands, it comes with a high price point that makes consumers assume that good quality is coming because the price point is so high. So a lot of consumers will eventually learn that even with a high price point, the quality is still bad, and that will lead to, customer satisfaction and trust reducing. And long term, that could be really fatal for a brand. So I think some of the way that these companies look at their processes is very short-sighted, but I understand why they do it, because they are only concerned with the needs and wants of the shareholders in the short term. I think it's a system problem. There's no like one individual. I think the whole system is just flawed, because a lot of CEOs, they are hired based on what they can do financially in the short term. So yes, they would love to do loads of things that help in the long term. But if they are doing loads of helpful things in the long term, they're probably going to get fired for not making loads of money in the short term. And the person that benefits is the CEO that comes in to replace that person, right? So yeah, the system needs an overhaul.
Wondering why? Keep watching. I want you to think about how many new pieces of clothing you bought last year. If you're anything like the average American, it was around 68. In 1980, that number was 12. But wait, it gets crazier.
You see what I was saying earlier, even in the previous stream around consumption. So the average American buys 68 items, but all the way back then it was 12. Okay, so 1980, there was an average of 12 clothing items per year. That's crazy.
Number was 12. But wait, it gets crazier. In the 80s, Americans spent about 7% of their annual income on clothes. Today, it's just 3%. We spend half as much, even though we're buying 5 times more. This Abercrombie ad from the 80s helps explain why. The high-quality wool was a huge selling point. They even tell you exactly where it's from. And notice how they say this is part of their fall collection? Because in the 80s and 90s, stores only had new clothes a couple times a year. Usually a spring-summer collection and a fall-winter collection. And designers would start working on each collection up to 9 months in advance.
Yeah, now we have resorts, pre-fall, pre-spring, pre-fall. Like, it's so hard to keep up with collections these days because collections just drop out of nowhere. Like, God, it's too many collections. And I talk about this quite a few times, but when COVID happened, I remember a lot of fashion people were talking about how fashion needs to slow down and fashion needs to go back to quality and people just doing fall, winter and spring, summer collections. Dries Van Noten came out and gave a statement about it. And everyone was like, yeah, it's so right. Like, fashion really needs to slow down. And the second that everything opened back up again, it went straight back to how it was. It's crazy. Ben is asking, do you think constant changing of trends has an effect on this? Oh yeah, 100%. Because people have to consume to, jump into the new trend. And I don't necessarily think there's anything inherently wrong with a fashion trend. I just think that you should see it as finding what you like in a fashion trend that you could see yourself wearing for years. That's the way you should consume. But just completely overhauling your wardrobe every couple of months to fit into the most current trend is a big issue. And I definitely think that this is something that happens more so now than then, because in the 80s, social media didn't exist. So trends lasted a long time, because for a trend to go through society properly and the news and the word of mouth for it to spread, it would just take a while. So even if people were doing what we do now, when I say we, I just mean collectively, where people just consume into the latest trend, it wouldn't have been to the same extent. And we've seen that by the stats, 12 garments per year.
Because clothing production takes a lot of work. They had to think of hundreds of unique designs and whittle them down to the dozen or so best ones, send the designs to the factory, go back and forth with them for months to create a prototype, choose the best fabric, the right embellishments, and figure out the proportions for different sizes. After all that, they'd place a massive order with the factory and then just pray the design would sell. It was kind of like a game of chance. You'd place 2 huge bets per year, and if your styles flopped, you'd be stuck with a whole bunch of clothes you'd have to sell at a discount or just throw away. That risk is...
Yeah, that's what happens with a lot of brands. I've talked about how I've worked at some brands where this has happened, right? Because it's kind of true. The business model is kind of risky because you make a collection and you're kind of just hoping that it sells. You don't really know if it's going to sell or not. Which is why a lot of companies now, they do see now, buy now. So buyers can come, pick what they like. If they don't necessarily like those pieces, then those things just won't go into production. But before then, it used to be very much like we produce the things. Hopefully we find people that can buy this stuff. And if not, we are just stuck with this immense amount of inventory, and we probably now have to sell this to TK or TJ Maxx, or it has to go to Walmart. That's how you see luxury garments at Walmart, for people that were wondering. So it is kind of risky, but I do think that the opposite, the direction we've gone in, where you have Zara and Shein, and I'm sure they'll talk about it in this video, where they have these processes where they kind of spit feed a collection and see what the response is, and they have all these computers and AI that determines what's selling well, and then based on what's selling, they then start producing more.
Why so much care and thoughtfulness went into making each piece of clothing, and why you could expect quality at every price point, even discount stores like Sears or JCPenney. Just look at the way JCPenney advertised their suits in this ad from the 80s.
2-piece suits that are expertly tailored, classically designed, and have an elegant touch.
They're not selling you on the price or the trendiness, but on the craftsmanship and design. Even one of the cheaper suits on the market was still pretty high quality, which is
This says a lot about modern consumers. That back then, how they used to market to people was you had to market the quality because that's what people valued. It says a lot about what fashion consumers value right now, where you no longer need to market that the garment is actually good quality. You're marketing something else, like a feeling, like a lifestyle.
probably why, if you adjust for inflation, this $160 suit would cost $600 today. If you go to JCPenney now, you can easily get a two-piece suit for under $200. So in the 80s and 90s, people were buying fewer clothes, but they'd be well-made pieces that would be worn for years. And keeping up with all the trends, well, that was something only wealthy people could do.
Pull the latest Briones and charge them to our account.
Yes, ma'am.
What are Briones?
6 months of my car payments plus a car.
Then came a little store called Zara, and everything began to change. The New York Times coined the term fast fashion in this 1989 article about the first US store of Zara. The latest trend is what we're after, a Zara executive told the Times. It takes 15 days between a new idea and getting it into the stores. Remember, that took most stores 9 months. How did Zara do it in 15 days? By streamlining this part of the production process with something called graze goods. Rather than manufacturing overseas, Zara built their own high-tech factories in Spain, all connected to headquarters by an underground monorail. There, robots working around the clock cut and dye fabrics to create unfinished, uncolored pieces that can be turned into any garment. Once a design is created, Zara can send those graze goods to their network of small shops in nearby regions, where they're transformed into finished dresses, trousers, and tops. Instead of huge...
So let's pause. So there are positives and negatives to this kind of production system. So the positive, like I said, is when you produce in this way, it reduces waste because you are basically trying to match the demand for a product as that demand exists. And so you're really using this AI to determine what consumers and customers are actually purchasing. And then essentially those robots and AI then produce those things. So I like the business model of it because it reduces waste. What I don't like, and what they probably won't mention in this video, is that's good, but then how are these clothes actually made though? That's the issue. And that goes back into what I always say about the fabrics. Everything is about speed, because the thing about this process is you want to meet the demand. Immediately the demand is there, because as the demand starts reducing, then you start reducing the production of those garments. So you cannot miss the boat. So once you see demand spiking for a garment, these processes have to streamline and accelerate to make sure that you can meet the demand. And how do you accelerate and meet the demand? By processing clothing as quickly as possible. What does that mean? Instead of air drying things for days like you should, they smash it in loads of heat to dry things and damage the fibers. Instead of slow dyeing, where the dyes actually get into the garments properly and they don't start leaking everywhere, they have to dye these garments quickly because they're trying to get these things to market as fast as possible. So I think the perfect production model would be using AI to drip feed garments slowly as they can see the demand, but kind of it not being as fast as Zara and Shein do it. If it was slightly slower, that would solve the problem of reducing waste, but also making sure that things are still made well. But unfortunately, because this process is really, really rapid, there's no way, it's literally impossible for the clothes to be well made, because it requires the clothing to be made very, very quickly.
Orders, Zara makes a small batch of each style to start with. The retail stores can then send feedback to headquarters about what's selling and what's not, and they can quickly ramp up production on whatever's popular, restocking within days if needed. It massively reduced the risk that came with clothing production. Instead of losing money on clearance sales or throwing away unsold goods, Zara's styles often sell out quickly. The designers don't have to predict trends a year in advance. They can just respond to fashion trends as they emerge, though sometimes that gets a little sketchy. For example, here's a look from the high fashion designer Celine from a collection that debuted on the Vogue runway in 2013. This skirt would have retailed for at least $1,000.
Correction, it didn't debut on Vogue Runway. Vogue Runway cover it. Of course, the person making this video is not like a fashion person, but it didn't debut on Vogue Runway. It debuted on the runway itself. But yeah, let's continue.
And here's a very similar looking skirt selling on Zara's website for just $80. According to the Wayback Machine, Zara had this skirt for sale by August, which would have been just a few weeks after Celine's version landed in boutiques. These runway knockoffs and how quickly Zara could get them into stores were wildly popular. By August 2008, Zara's parent company Inditex became the world's largest fashion retailer. This is also when you had the rise of two other fast fashion giants of the new millennium.
The time that really stands out to me when you really started to notice Zara copying high-end fashion was that time when Yeezy was really big. Like around the time of Yeezy Season 1 and Yeezy Season 2, Zara looked like a knockoff Yeezy store. All the color palettes were the same. The silhouettes were the same. It was actually quite crazy. Even the footwear, they were making their cheaper versions of the footwear. It was literally like a knockoff Yeezy store for a while. And that's when people started to realize that, yeah, like you just needed to wait for Zara to make the high fashion, the cheaper high fashion version. It started to become a thing.
21 and H&M, which pioneered a new way to bring the runway to the masses. They'd partner with luxury designers to make exclusive lines for H&M at affordable prices, starting with Karl Lagerfeld in 2004.
God, is it true? Of course it's true.
This part of the story...
This is interesting. Q says, I used to work at Zara around that time when I was in uni and there was always a line on weekends. Yeah, because back then I remember Zara pieces really used to sell out. Like they were so hyped because people really wanted these garments. But to be honest, most of them weren't affordable. So you could just go to Zara and get like the Yeezy versions. It was insane. 2014 to 2017, Zara had a dominating run. That's very, very true. Like Zara used to do numbers back then. I don't know about now, but yeah. Also, they were talking about the luxury collaborations. The main reason they do luxury collaborations is a lot of these luxury brands want a way for people that can't afford their garments to still have access to their garments. From a business perspective, it doesn't really do anything for fast fashion brands because the quantities that are being sold when they do these high fashion collaborations are really tiny. So it doesn't really move the needle financially for any of the fast fashion companies. They just do it because it kind of helps with branding and it shows that, you know, we associate and align with these luxury brands, so we can't be that bad.
Zara could get them into stores were wildly popular. By August 2008, Zara's parent company Inditex became the world's largest fashion retailer. This is also when you had the rise of two other fast fashion giants of the new millennium, Forever 21 and H&M, which pioneered a new way to bring the runway to the masses. They'd partner with luxury designers to make exclusive lines for H&M at affordable prices, starting with Karl Lagerfeld in 2004.
God, is it true? Of course it's true.
This part of the story, it seems sort of like a win for the 99%. Fast fashion was making it so that anyone could wear runway designs while they were still popular. That was a new thing. Of course, encouraging lots of consumers to buy low-cost clothes that would go out of style.
Yep, you can even see, like, look at how long these queues are. That, I definitely remember a time when, like, a lot of these fast fashion brands had their eye on the pulse like that, to where people really wanted to buy these clothes in droves.
Consumers to buy low-cost clothes that would go out of style quickly would shockingly have some downsides too, but we'll come back to that. Because we can't give the minds behind Zara and H&M all the credit for the rise of fast fashion. We also have to give some credit to Bill Clinton. No, not because of his sick style. In 1994, President Clinton signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which made it cheaper to make clothes in Mexico. And a few years later, he normalized trade relations with China. Textile factories started moving out of the US because now clothing retailers had access to the largest pool of cheap labor in human history. Luckily, there was a law from the 70s, the multi-fiber arrangement, which limited how much clothing American and European countries could import from other nations. Unfortunately, the World Trade Organization let it expire in 2005.
Of course they let it expire. I was just waiting to see how exactly, because there's no way there's a limit on garments coming from these regions. So I knew it would have expired. Why wasn't it renewed though? Governments, 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 money, money, money.
Ushering the heyday of fast fashion, because now there was nothing stopping companies from producing everything in the countries with the lowest wages, the fewest labor laws, and the laxest environmental regulations. We've arrived at the fashion landscape that I remember from my teens. In the 2000s, you had 4 distinct buying options ranging in price and quality.
Okay, let's see. So at the top, they've got Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton, Dolce & Gabbana, Giorgio Armani, and Versace. That makes sense. Macy's. Wait, Macy's, Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, Bloomingdale's, JCPenney. Is Macy's viewed the same as Neiman Marcus? I would have put Macy's in the section below, where like Aldo and American Apparel, Abercrombie and Fitch, Hollister. What's at the bottom? H&M, Topshop, Uniqlo, Forever 21, Westfield, Zara. Okay, I agree with most of it for the most part, but yeah, I don't know about putting Nordstrom in the same place as Macy's, and that doesn't make sense to me. I think they need to switch this graph up a bit. That's a bit crazy.
Ranging in price and quality. High fashion or luxury brands, department stores, mall brands, and fast fashion. But these days, it kind of feels like the bottom of this pyramid has collapsed and everything's a little cheaper and shittier. J. Crew, Anthropologie, Abercrombie, these didn't used to be considered fast fashion, but now they arguably are. And that's because of 2 very big things that changed the experience of shopping into the hellscape of today. The first is the 2008 financial crisis. Middle-class consumers no longer had as much money to spend, so they began drifting over to cheaper options.
While all of the other non-fast fashion retailers were struggling, Forever 21 was opening store after store after store. H&M, the same thing. Zara is spreading into other cities. And so the conversation began, how do we compete here? What if we continue to show the same prices on the price tags that we always have? But we know that we're going to sell most of the units of that style on sale. And we plan for that.
So let's say this dress costs $40 to make, and it retailed for $100 in 2007. In 2010, during the recession, the retailer would keep the price tag at $100, but expect that most pieces will only sell once it goes on sale. So they'll only spend, let's say, $15 to make it. So they'll still...
And this is what I tell people, that the business model of a lot of these companies, the only way to continue making money at some point, if you can't increase price, is to reduce the cost. It's normal. And I think there's nothing wrong with that per se, so long as the quality doesn't just get so significantly bad that it's an unrecognizable product, which I think clothing has gotten to that point. If you're reducing costs, but for the consumer, there isn't like a very clear difference in quality, that's fine. If you've just found maybe a supplier that will do something cheaper and it's, you know, everything is above board, I think that's fine. Most businesses operate like that, but it's in fashion, they just overdo it. They always take it to the absolute extreme in fashion. And that's what I have an issue with.
Make a profit. And how do you make clothes for cheap? Well, by making cheaper clothes. You add synthetic materials like polyester instead of selling pure natural fibers like cotton and wool. You skimp on details like pockets, buttons, and zippers, and offer less sizes.
Not do you only skimp on details like buttons and zips, you use cheaper zips and cheaper buttons also.
I could see all these things play out in the clothing I bought, like these men's jeans from Abercrombie from the 2000s versus now. The vintage pair weighs a hefty 761 grams and is 100% cotton.
They feel substantial, long-lasting, really high-quality denim. They have a decent amount of distressing on here that was probably done by hand to sort of break down areas, make them softer. In the fast fashion era, a lot of this is skipped, where it's just like, let's just spray them with acid or do other things that are like actually like...
This is exactly what I was talking about when I say that the business model of companies like Zara, it mandates that you have to bring these clothes to market as quickly as possible while the demand is still there, because you're trying to maximize the demand. So how do you get garments to consumers as fast as possible? You have to process it in the fastest time. So like I've said, instead of slow dyeing things, leaving things to air dry so the fabrics don't shrink and aren't damaged, they're just spraying these things with acid and doing all these crazy things so that they can be processed faster. So that's one of the big issues I have with the way that a lot of clothing is made these days.
Probably done by hand to sort of break down areas, make them softer. In the fast fashion era, a lot of this is skipped, where it's just like, let's just spray them with acid or do other things that are like actually like very toxic.
The new pair weighs less at 720 grams and is a cotton elastane blend.
This is that fast fashion trick of, okay, if we add a little bit of stretch, it will fit more people theoretically, and they'll be less likely to return them. But putting elastane in jeans shortens the lifespan pretty significantly. Those elastane fibers that are woven in here, they're plastic and they break. And the more you wash them, the sooner they break. But you get into the cycle where you have to wash the jeans more often to get them to go back to size because they get stretched out.
The other main difference between these jeans, the zippers.
We have a legit, luxurious zipper. Long-lasting, 100% metal. They smoothly go up and down. Like, these are things that you take for granted until you get a bad zipper. The new pair, when you were trying to unzip these, that sound, you can feel like this.
Those are kind of zippers that, you know, guys, when you have like a bag and you're trying to zip something, like maybe you have a few things in your bag and you zip something, then the zip just breaks. Like most of these new fast fashion garments, the zip feels like it's going to break every time you zip it up or down. It's actually quite concerning. It's quite concerning, but that's the only way that you skimp on garments to make a profit. You either have to use cheaper zips, or you remove the lining, or you put less pockets there, so you're using less fabric, or the thread you use is cheaper, but it's not as rigid as and not as strong, and that's why a lot of garments now you just see loose threads everywhere because the threads are so terrible. It's so many different aspects to it.
Zipper's going to be a problem soon.
This is a difference of maybe 50 cents, but it's a pennies game to get the pricing to work with the targets you're given.
Another area that you can really see how quality degraded is with sweaters. We compared an Anthropologie sweater from today to a vintage sweater made in the 90s.
This sweater is Liz Claiborne, which is like Anthropologie before Anthropologie.
The vintage sweater is 100% wool. The one made today is 100% polyester. The vintage sweater has metal buttons. The other one has no buttons at all. The vintage sweater is a size medium. The one made today is one size.
When I see one size in something, I'm like, oh, it's because they couldn't afford to buy it in sizes to meet the margin targets.
Even with all these cost-cutting measures, traditional retailers were struggling. And that's around the time private equity firms started buying them up, saddling them with debt, and letting all the business decisions be made by finance bros whose idea of fashion is that Patagonia vest over again.
Oh, no hate on the finance, bro. No hate on the finance, bros. Not the Patagonia with the white shirt. Chad, Tad, Brad, and Thad. It's a fleece feast, not the finance bros, not the Patagonia vest. That is hilarious. When the financial bros started taking over fashion and deciding they know what's best. I know this. I've definitely worked for a fashion brand where the CEO is a guy from a tech company and he doesn't have the slightest clue about fashion. And he was trying to tell us how the marketing campaign should look, and it would have looked like some outdated M&S campaign. That's funny. That's hilarious. Chad, Tad, Brad, and Thad.
I'm sure. And on top of all that, there's still that other huge change that I mentioned, the final death knell in quality clothing, the internet. Social media and fast fashion are a match made in heaven. Social media helps shorten our attention spans, which extends to fashion trends too, which cycle through faster and faster. That makes fast fashion indispensable to influencers who rely on a steady stream of new clothes for their content. This puts pressure on all of us to wear a...
That's why I warn you guys also about these content creators that just consume, because they get paid by these fast fashion brands to just promote the overconsumption that makes, you know, young people feel like they need to own these things to be accepted. It's part of the problem. It's part of the problem. Influencers should buy things that they want. There's nothing wrong with buying clothes that you like, but having a different outfit every day, we need to slow down at that point. So yeah, always be wary of those kind of influencers. You have to be wary of those people.
Indispensable to influencers who rely on a steady stream of new clothes for their content. This puts pressure on all of us to wear a totally unique, never-before-seen outfit every single day, which is pretty hard.
Lizzie McGuire, you are an outfit repeater.
You are an outfit repeater. That I still find it so weird that it's actually a thing where people shame people for repeating outfits. It's so silly. It's so silly.
I guess now it's time to talk about Shein, Zara's more chaotic little sister, the logical conclusion of fast fashion. Shein is a company that focuses on selling as much hyper trendy, super low quality clothing they can for mind-blowingly cheap prices. Shein raked in close to $10 billion.
Also, Leo made a really strong point in the chat. If you watch enough of some of these people's content, you realize they don't know what they like. Well, they can't, because apart from them actually just having to buy clothing to meet the demands of the kind of content they make, which is to continue making new styling videos and to wear different outfits every day on Instagram. Also, they get sent clothing, but I think a lot of these influencers, they aren't like fully truthful. Because if they told people that I got sent all of this stuff, then their consumers would be like, so should I really be buying all these things when you didn't even buy them yourself? If you wouldn't put your own hard-earned money into buying these clothes, why should I? So that's why a lot of these influencers sometimes will be a bit vague and act like they bought everything, even when everything is being sent. Like they know what they're doing. And there have been some exposés of a lot of influencers doing that.
In 2020. It's currently the biggest clothing retailer in the world, even beating out Amazon in the US. Shein is not just fast fashion, it's instant fashion. Zara can get products from drawing board to store in 15 days, Shein can do it in 3. Zara can release 35,000 new items of clothes per year. Shein will release that many in just a couple weeks. So how do they do it? Rather than functioning as a cohesive clothing manufacturer with its own factories like Zara, Shein is more like Amazon, a huge marketplace selling clothes from thousands of independent Chinese factories. And it treats those factories sort of like Uber treats its drivers. The factories are hooked up to Shein's software that collects real-time feedback about which items are selling well and which aren't. The software then sends alerts to the factory owners' phones to ramp up or slow down production. It's Zara's small batch production on steroids. And just like other billionaires, Shein finds creative ways to avoid US taxes. See, when you buy something from Shein, your clothes are shipped to you directly from the factory in China. There's no
Of course. Of course.
big Amazon-style warehouses in the US full of Shein dresses. And since packages valued at under $800 can enter the US duty-free, Shein merchandise is pretty much always exempt from consumer goods tariffs. That exemption, it's called de minimis, was originally created so you could buy a rug or a lamp while you're on vacation and ship it back to yourself without having to pay tariffs. Not for big clothing retailers. 50 years of fast fashion and ultra fast fashion has completely changed our relationship with clothes.
So if that's the case, why don't they just change the law? So if it wasn't meant for big corporations, why don't they just change it to where maybe garments over a certain value has to be taxed? So they have to make it big because it's big companies. Maybe garments over the value of like $100,000 have to go through certain tax charges or duties so that people who are still buying, let's say, rugs or whatever abroad can send it back tax-free. Because if your rugs are more than $100,000, then I don't know what to say to you, to be honest. That's the way that they can catch these companies. But they don't do it. But sometimes I always wonder why they don't do it. Is it because they are getting money under the table from these companies? Is it that they just don't care enough? Like, what is the exact reason? Because if they were able to tax these companies, they could get some of that money. I guess the rebuttal to that would be that if you tax companies too much, then they leave your economy entirely and then there's no money for the economy rather than having a bit. But interesting conversation to have, for sure.
Instead of being something to cherish and care for, they're now just another cheap and disposable plastic consumer good. Thanks to fast fashion, clothing retailer is in a race to the bottom death spiral. Everything is fast fashion now. And the thing is, all this overproduction, it doesn't just affect clothing quality. When private equity and fast fashion companies greedily maximize their profits no matter what the cost, that hurts workers across the entire textile supply chain. Now, mass-producing clothing has always relied on extremely exploitative labor and dangerous working conditions.
People in the chat are saying the lobbyists that donate to political parties. Yeah, that's the thing about, because in the US, with the political system, there are these massive corporations that donate to people's political campaigns, which I've always found a really weird process of doing things, because obviously it means that these people, when they are in power, they're going to be biased to certain industries that paid for their campaigns. They almost have to do the bidding of these corporations. They're like puppet of the corporations that paid for them to even be in that position. So it's just like, what's the point of having a president that can't really do anything because the corporations control the president? It's a bit insane when you actually think about it. It's really, really insane.
But as the industry gets bigger, the casualties and abuses do keep growing. Like when a garment factory collapsed in Bangladesh in 2013, killing over 1,000 workers. But the fast fashion companies that produce clothes there hardly faced any accountability. So it's no surprise that nearly 10 years later, a 2021 investigation by Public Eye, a Swiss human rights group, showed that factories that supply Shein are crowded and unsafe, with blocked emergency exits and people regularly working over 75 hours a week. Slavery is still an issue too. According to recent investigations, anywhere between 20 and 30% of clothes being sold in the US contain cotton from Xinjiang, a region in China with cotton farms that rely on forced labor from Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities.
The prices that we are offered on these clothes, that are the prices we're willing to pay, are not based in a reality where everybody involved is paid a living wage and works under good conditions. I mean, they're built off of cutting corners and exploitation.
Now, I want you to once again think of all those new clothes you bought last year. How many of them will you still be wearing next year? The year after? The average American gets rid of 81 pounds of clothes per year, and that's nothing compared to the hundreds of billions of pounds of unsold clothing and returns that manufacturers and retailers throw away. No one actually knows how much exactly it is, but we do know that you can see the world's textile waste from space. This mountain.
Well, people don't know how much exactly it is because they dump all these garments in countries like Nigeria and Ghana and India, and they just, leave it there. My theory, once again, because I'm from Nigeria and I know Nigeria has one of the most corrupt governments in the world. I know for a fact Nigerian governors are definitely taking money under the table to use Nigeria as a dumping ground for a lot of waste that comes from Western countries and developed nations like the US. They just use Nigeria as like a wasteland. I can't really speak to Ghana or India how that works, but they definitely dump a lot of the waste from the West in India and Ghana too. So that's why people don't know, because people are kind of dissociated from it because it isn't in their country, right? It's someone else's problem.
Of discarded clothes in Chile's Atacama Desert grows by 39,000 tons per year. The polyester that's in almost all clothing these days will take centuries to decompose. None of this bad PR is slowing down textile production at all. Shein is on the verge of an IPO on the London Stock Exchange with a $64 billion valuation. That kind of stuff makes the fast fashion industry seem unstoppable, but there are people fighting back. First, there's that de minimis tax exemption we talked about that allowed Shein to evade tariffs. A bipartisan group of lawmakers are trying to close that loophole.
Okay, perfect. So I asked the question earlier and I was like, why don't they just change that? It's not hard. Like logically, if the whole point of them putting that there in the first place was to make sure that citizens from the country could buy small items and send them back home without paying any tax, then they just have to determine how much should a small item cost, and anything above that should be taxed. I would make it really high just in case you don't know what people are sending back, which is why I said 100K. I feel like past 100K, it's either not a small item or it's so expensive you're rich enough to be able to afford the tariffs. If you're buying a rug that costs more than $100,000, you can probably afford whatever tax is coming. So yeah. It's kind of crazy, though, that people are lobbying for it and the government doesn't just do it because it's logical. It makes a lot of sense. But obviously the lobbying, like we've talked about, and the fact that these corporations, for the most part, control the government because they are the people that put the people in government in place in the first place. So they kind of have to do the bidding of these corporations, which is why I genuinely think that a lot of Western political systems, and this is a total different conversation, outside of fashion, but I think the way the systems function is extremely flawed because a government is supposed to be the body that makes sure that everything is above board and hold corporations accountable. But how can you hold a corporation accountable when that corporation is the reason why you're in a position of power? So you know as an individual that if you do anything that works against these corporations, they can remove you as easily as they put you there. So that means that the whole point of the political system is very flawed, extremely flawed.
Meanwhile, New York lawmakers have introduced legislation to create, for the first time, legally binding environmental and labor standards for the industry. And dozens of brands have been investigated for using cotton from Xinjiang, including H&M, Nike, Uniqlo, Burberry, and Shein. But there's still a lot to be done, and the industry is going to fight every...
Oof, Burberry, they cannot catch a break. Burberry just does all the bad things, don't they? Like, I talk about this sometimes, but you guys might not know, but there was a scandal that came out in 2018 where Burberry was like seen and found to be burning their bags, clothes and perfume worth millions that they weren't selling because they were protecting their brand, right? So they didn't want any unsold goods, so they burnt it. And a company being able to burn products tells you that it cannot cost that much to make. No company is just going to burn and destroy things that is difficult to make and is expensive to make. So it even brings into question that these things are so disposable to these countries that they can literally burn them and destroy them. It says a lot. It says a hell of a lot.
Step of the way. Remember when I said Shein's IPO is in London? The reason they're not doing it in New York is because they didn't want to comply with US regulations that would force them to make disclosures about forced labor in their supply chain. They haven't given up though. They're lawyering up and lobbying against those regulations. Fast fashion is the...
So there's your answer. They are lawyering up and lobbying against the regulations. And so why this is important is because anytime that a fashion brand, especially these fast fashion brands, say that they're doing a sustainable collection or they care about sustainability or they hire some sustainability expert, do not take them seriously. These are the same people that are lobbying against, having to pay a certain tax because they've been exploiting a tax loophole that allows them to exploit workers and to ship clothing at crazy rates and promoting overconsumption. So don't take any of these companies seriously when they say that we care about sustainability. We are doing a recycled collection, recycled garments, upcycling garments. Don't take any of them seriously.
Story of unchecked corporate greed in a bargain for lower prices for, well, you. Though, as we've shown, that hasn't actually worked out for consumers. We need lawmakers to continue cracking down on corporations like Shein, because we all deserve clothes that look and feel good, but don't require exploiting workers and destroying the planet just to be affordable.
So yeah, that was a really good video. Very, very telling on where clothing is going. I always wonder, and this is me pondering to myself when I'm just alone, just thinking. I always wonder to myself, are these things reversible? And if we reverse all these things, how exactly will we go around reversing these things? Because I just can't see a world in which things get worse and worse and worse to the point where our clothing is so bad that the second that you put on a garment, the whole thing disintegrates. Surely at that point, no one will accept that, and everything would have to reverse. So I always wonder, at what point will that reversal happen? And will it take a lot of these corporations to absolutely fold in mass for us to see a change in the way that these garments are created and in the way that the manufacturing industry works and functions? I always wonder. I always wonder. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club, where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.